Okay. What is meaningful learning? With the help of, all of these newly learned philosophers and their beliefs, along with all my classmates' work and the discussions we had in class, I'm going to attempt to answer this loaded question. So for my video project, I set up just this short slideshow that I'm going to talk over, and I organized it in this chronological order. So starting with some of our first philosophers and answering the question of what was meaningful learning then, what did it look like, and then moving to kind of like where we are now. And then ending with our future potential with public education, kind of where are we falling short, and what could meaningful learning be. So, in order to set the scene of where we can go with public education and meaningful learning, we need to know kind of where we started. And so, in the course, an analysis of public education begins in the 1700s when, Mary Wollstonecraft was fighting for women to have the same rights to education as their male counterparts. And so, the education system, and honestly the world at large, was riddled with sexism and racism, and these were seeping into institutions and policy. And so, schools, formal schooling, only existed for wealthy males of European descent. And when women did go to school, it was for, domestic household duties. They were learning skills like how to sew, how to read, how to cook, and they were not offered any higher education. So education was not equitable, and Wollstonecraft spoke openly about women's rights, and specifically their right to education, in saying that I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves. And so now I'm going to definitely fast forward to this era of existentialism, which we learned is the philosophical belief that all of us are responsible in creating our own meaning in our own lives. And so this is occurring in the 1940s, where these existentialist thinkers are beginning to kind of lay the foundations for a lot of the learning theories that we actually use today. In class, we talked about some examples such as like constructivism and differentiation. And so Sartre introduces this work in existentialist thinking in his work called Existentialism as a Humanism. So here we are now, right? In his work on liberty, John Stuart Mill emphasizes that this like individuality piece stemming from existentialism, the freedom to voice our own opinions, to voice our own expressions, to engage in discussion and debate. And so I came up with a few words that kind of describes where we are now and what does meaningful learning look like now in our classrooms. And I'm going to start with this word authentic. So meaningful learning is authentic. It's based on student interests. Students are interested for authentic factors. And so in the classroom, this looks like they're motivated beyond like such as getting the grade or just going through the motions. It's learning that definitely goes beyond the rote memorization of facts and kind of puts students at the center of the learning through critical thinking or, critical action, debate, discussion, and all those very student-centered pedagogical practices, which is how meaningful learning is taking place in an authentic way. Meaningful learning now also takes place in specific environments. It flourishes in an environment founded on caring and empathetic relationships. And we saw this in Nell Nodding's theory of care and education with 4 specific concepts. I think, and thinking about what that looks like in our classrooms, meaningful learning takes place when student-teacher relationships are strong, when they're trusting, when teachers have bias-free attitudes, when they have asset-based frameworks, and when they're engaging in constant self-reflection. It also occurs in environments where the teacher is the facilitator. We talked a lot about this in class. What I think that means is that the knowledge is a two-way street, and like the teacher is not the sole holder of this knowledge, and the teacher shares the knowledge amongst their students, and is kind of this facilitator in a way. And the last way I'll describe meaningful learning kind of now and how we're looking at it is through Foucault. And he says we are subjected to the production of truth through power, and we cannot exercise power except through the production of truth. And so what he depicts in his work is this constant like triangle of right, power, and truth, which leads to our connection of knowledge and power. And it's definitely not a hierarchical power, kind of one over the other, but what he's talking about is this power kind of like circulating through knowledge and truth. So what meaningful learning does and how I think it should be viewed is exactly this in a power sense. I think education is sometimes taken for granted. It's not, being executed to its potential, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But we should be viewing education and learning as a gift, as an opportunity, and as a means of power. It makes it all the more meaningful. And so this kind of made me question, is this happening now? Like, who has access to such power through meaningful learning? And what I'm going to get into is that, and answering the question of kind of like, in an ideal world, what can meaningful learning be? So yes, it's not the 1700s. Women have this right to education. We all have this right to education and public education system. But the public education system is still functioning as a for-profit institution. It's functioning within these red line districts and zones and kind of benefiting those that have benefited from such institutions from the start. And so, as you can see, I literally took a screenshot of our last class conversation of this Jamboard. Such huge societal issues such as racism, gender identity, sexism, homophobia, etc. They're just being left out of the conversation at the places that are supposed to be educating the youth of our country. And so we heard Cornel West and Myles Horton, talk about this issue of equity. Cornel West talks about it in the political sense and kind of in a more societal sense, and Horton talks about it directly in our school system, kind of our school system as an institution. West says this crisis of Black leadership contributes to political cynicism among Black people. It encourages the idea that we cannot really make the difference in our changing our society. And then Horton speaks to this idea of public school functioning as an institution and saying they don't know that the institution is dedicated to perpetuating a system and they're serving an institution. Meaningful learning is educational practices as the practice of freedom. And we see this according to bell hooks. So what can meaningful learning be? It has to be freeing. She kind of walks us through so many pedagogical strategies in her work, Teaching to Transgress, that basically get down to the fact that, we're not doing them. And right now, schools are functioning more like prisons than anything else. Hooks in her feminist work speaks about the feminist movement and basically says that the feminist movement needs to see forward progress, and that the only way to attain this, she says, is to completely restructure the U.S. society. So, what does this mean for us right now? I think it just really goes to show that society and the public education system has, such a long way to go to truly attain this meaningful learning. And lastly, in an ideal world, meaningful learning is education for change. We see a glimpse of this type of work happening in a non-traditional K-12 setting at the Highlander Folk School, which I put pictures of on the screen here. This is the 1932 school on the left and the 2022 school on the right, same school. However, a lot of the founders and members of the school make it clear that one of the reasons why this school was so successful is because it was not a part of the K-12 public education system. The work that was taking place at this schools was not according to a certain set of specific state standards, right? It was work that was challenging societal norms, teaching people how to read so they could exercise their right to vote, organizing civil rights movements. And so, although we cannot replicate the schools throughout the country, its sentiments of, social justice focused, student interest and passion in creating change need to be seen in our K-12 public schools through curriculum and pedagogy for true meaningful learning to take place.